My name is Sarah Mitchell, and what I'm about to tell you will shake you to your core. 3 months ago, I was lying in a hospital bed, broken and fighting for my life, when I heard the man I'd loved for 8 years tell my doctor that I was better off dead. Those 4 words changed everything. They revealed a truth so devastating that it nearly destroyed me, but ultimately, they gave me the strength to rebuild myself into someone I never knew I could become. The rain was coming down in sheets that October evening when everything changed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I remember driving home from my book club meeting, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the downpour. I was thinking about David, my husband of 8 years, and how he'd seemed distant lately. He'd been working longer hours at his accounting firm, coming home exhausted and irritable. I'd attributed it to stress from tax season, but deep in my gut, something felt different. Something felt wrong. I never saw the truck that ran the red light. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. My compact sedan crumpled like paper against the massive delivery truck that slammed into my driver's side. The sound of metal crushing and glass shattering was the last thing I remembered before everything went black. When I finally regained consciousness 3 days later, I was in the intensive care unit at Riverside General Hospital, my body a landscape of broken bones and internal injuries. My left leg was shattered in 4 places, requiring multiple surgeries and metal rods to piece it back together. 3 ribs were broken, one of which had punctured my lung, necessitating a chest tube that made every breath feel like fire. My skull had been fractured, causing a traumatic brain injury that left me struggling to remember simple words and fighting waves of nausea that seemed to never end. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about spinal compression, possible permanent nerve damage, and a recovery timeline that stretched into years, not months. But physical pain, as excruciating as it was, paled in comparison to the emotional devastation that was waiting for me. I drifted in and out of consciousness during those first few days, riding waves of medication-induced fog that made it difficult to distinguish between dreams and reality. Sometimes I'd wake to see David sitting in the chair beside my bed, his head in his hands, and I'd feel a flutter of comfort knowing he was there. Other times, I'd surface from the darkness to find him pacing by the window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, urgent tones that I couldn't quite make out. It was during one of these semi-conscious states, when the medical staff believed I was sleeping, that I heard the conversation that would haunt me for months to come. Dr. Rebecca Chen, my attending physician, had entered my room for what I assumed was a routine check. I could hear the soft squeak of her shoes against the linoleum floor, the gentle rustle of her lab coat as she moved around my bed. David was there too. I could sense his presence even with my eyes closed, that familiar cologne he wore mixing with the antiseptic hospital smell. "How is she really, doctor?" David's voice was strained, but there was something else there, something I couldn't identify. "I mean, what are we looking at long term?" Dr. Chen's voice was professional, measured. "Mr. Mitchell, your wife has suffered significant trauma. The brain injury alone will require extensive rehabilitation. Her mobility will be severely limited for the foreseeable future, possibly permanently. She'll need round-the-clock care for months, maybe years. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. The medical bills alone will be substantial, even with insurance." There was a long pause, and I could hear David's labored breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but the words cut through me like shards of glass. "Doctor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. With the extent of her injuries, with the brain damage, with everything she's facing, would she really want to live like this? I mean, Sarah was always so independent, so active. She ran marathons, she hiked mountains, she lived for adventure. Looking at her now, seeing what her life is going to be like, don't you think she'd be better off dead?" The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of my heart monitor, which had suddenly begun racing. I felt like I was drowning, like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. This was my husband, the man who had promised to love me in sickness and in health, suggesting to my doctor that I would be better off dead. Dr. Chen's response was swift and sharp. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand you're overwhelmed, but I need you to understand something. Your wife is going to recover. It will be difficult, it will take time, but people with her injuries do go on to lead meaningful lives. What she needs right now is support, not someone questioning whether her life is worth living. But the cost, doctor? The financial burden alone could destroy everything we've built. Our savings, the business, the house. And for what? So she can spend the rest of her life as an invalid who can't even remember her own name half the time? I wanted to scream, to sit up and confront him, but my body was too weak, too broken. All I could do was lie there, tears streaming silently down my cheeks, as the man I had trusted with my life revealed his true colors. Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Chen's voice had taken on an edge of disgust. I think you need to examine your priorities. Your wife is alive, and with proper care and support, she can have a future. The question isn't whether she's better off dead. The question is whether you're prepared to be the husband she married, or whether you're going to abandon her when she needs you most. I heard David's footsteps moving toward the door, his voice cold and distant as he replied, I need some air. I'll be back later. But he wasn't back later. In fact, as I would soon discover, David had no intention of being back at all. The next morning, when I was finally strong enough to stay awake for more than a few minutes at a time, I asked the nurse where my husband was. She looked uncomfortable, glancing toward the door before telling me that he had spoken with the discharge planning team about transferring me to a long-term care facility as soon as I was medically stable. A care facility? I managed to croak out, my throat raw from the breathing tube that had been removed just the day before. It's common for patients with your level of injuries, she said gently, but I could see the pity in her eyes. Your husband mentioned that he wouldn't be able to provide the level of care you need at home. My heart shattered into pieces. Not only had David written me off as better off dead, but he was planning to warehouse me in some institution where he could forget about me entirely. The woman who had supported his dreams, who had worked 2 jobs to help him start his accounting firm, who had put her own career aspirations on hold to be his partner in every sense of the word, was now nothing more than an inconvenient burden to be disposed of. But if David thought I was going to quietly fade away, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. Over the next few days, as my cognitive function slowly improved and the fog of medication began to lift, I started paying closer attention to the conversations happening around me. I noticed that David's visits became shorter and less frequent. When he did come, he spent most of his time on his phone, dealing with what he called, quote, business emergencies that always seemed to require his immediate attention. It was during one of these phone calls that I caught fragments of conversations that made my blood run cold. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No, Tom, we need to move fast on this, David was saying, pacing by the window with his back to me. The business accounts need to be restructured before she's well enough to ask questions. And the insurance payout for the accident should be substantial. We just need to make sure it's handled properly. Tom Bradley had been David's business partner and best friend since college. I had always liked Tom, had considered him family, but hearing David discuss restructuring business accounts while I lay broken in a hospital bed sent chills down my spine. The house is the biggest concern, David continued. It's in both our names, but with her condition, we might be able to make the case for incompetency. Nancy thinks we should explore our options. Nancy was David's sister, a sharp-tongued real estate agent who had never particularly liked me. She'd always felt that David could have done better, that he'd married beneath his station when he chose a librarian over someone with more lucrative career prospects. But hearing that she was involved in discussions about my competency while I was still fighting to recover was a betrayal that cut deeper than I could have imagined. As the days passed, I began to see a pattern emerging. David wasn't just planning to abandon me. He was systematically working to ensure that when he did, he'd walk away with everything we'd built together. The business we'd started with my inheritance from my grandmother. The house I'd helped design and decorate. The life insurance policies and investment accounts that represented years of careful financial planning. But David had made one crucial mistake. He assumed that the brain injury had left me too addled and weak to fight back. He had no idea that every cruel word, every scheming phone call, every callous abandonment was being cataloged in my increasingly sharp mind. I started keeping a mental record of everything I witnessed, the dates and times of his visits, the names mentioned in his phone calls, the visitors who came to see him instead of me. Marcus, the night security guard, had taken a liking to me and often stopped by to chat during his rounds. He mentioned seeing David in the parking lot at odd hours, sometimes with Tom, sometimes with Nancy, always looking like they were planning something important. "Your husband's been meeting with a lot of people lately," Marcus observed one evening, his kind eyes filled with concern. "Lawyers, I think. Insurance people. Seems like more business than a person should be handling while his wife's in the hospital." That's when I realized the full scope of what David was planning. He wasn't just going to abandon me. He was going to ensure that I had nothing to come back to, no resources to fight him with, no foundation to rebuild my life upon. He was going to leave me broken and destitute, probably in some state-run facility where I'd be forgotten by everyone who had ever mattered to me. But David had underestimated the woman he'd married. The same determination that had carried me through graduate school while working full-time, that had helped me run 3 marathons and climb 2 mountains, that had supported him through the lean years when his business was struggling, was still there, buried beneath the physical trauma but burning brighter than ever. I started making my own phone calls. The first call was to Angela Rodriguez, a family law attorney whose name I remembered from a legal clinic I'd attended at the library the year before. When I explained my situation, her voice immediately sharpened with professional interest. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Angela said. "Don't sign anything your husband brings you. Don't agree to any transfers or changes to accounts. Don't let him convince you that you're too sick to understand what's happening. And start documenting everything you can remember about his behavior since the accident." "But what if he's right?" I whispered into the phone, my voice breaking. "What if I really am too damaged to handle my own affairs? The brain injury, the memory problems, the fact that I can barely walk." "Sarah," Angela's voice was firm but kind, "the fact that you're having this conversation with me, that you're aware enough to be concerned about your rights, tells me that you're far more competent than your husband wants anyone to believe. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." That conversation gave me the first hope I'd felt since waking up in this nightmare. I wasn't as helpless as David thought I was. My mind might be healing, my body might be broken, but my spirit was intact, and I was going to fight. The second call was to my sister Jessica, who lived across the country in Seattle. We'd grown apart over the years, our different life choices creating a distance that I'd always meant to bridge, but never seemed to find the time for. When I told her what was happening, she was silent for a long moment before exploding with fury. "That bastard," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "I never liked him, Sarah. I know you thought I was being overprotective, but there was always something calculating about David. The way he looked at your bank account when Grandma died, the way he pushed you to put his name on everything. I was hoping I was wrong." "Jess, I need help," I admitted, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. I'd always been the strong one, the one who took care of everyone else. "I don't know how to fight this alone." "You're not alone," she said firmly. "I'm booking a flight tonight. Whatever David is planning, we're going to stop him." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the accident. Power. Not the physical power I'd lost, but something deeper and more enduring. The power that comes from knowing you're not going to be a victim. The power that comes from deciding to fight back. David had no idea what was coming for him. Jessica arrived at Riverside General Hospital like a force of nature. I hadn't seen my sister in over 2 years, but the moment she walked into my room, I felt a surge of strength I hadn't experienced since before the accident. Her red hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, her green eyes blazing with protective fury, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years climbing the corporate ladder in Seattle's tech industry. "Where is he?" were her first words as she set down her overnight bag and moved to my bedside. The question wasn't really directed at me. It was more of a declaration of war. "He left about an hour ago," I told her, my voice still weak but steadier than it had been in days. "Said he had meetings with the insurance adjusters." Jessica's mouth tightened into a thin line. "I bet he does. Sarah, I've been thinking about this the entire flight, and I think we need to move faster than he expects." Men like David count on their victims being too weak or too confused to fight back immediately. The longer we wait, the more time he has to cover his tracks. She pulled out her laptop and a legal pad, transforming my sterile hospital room into a makeshift war room. Tell me everything again, but this time I want dates, times, names, specific conversations you overheard. We're going to build a timeline of his behavior since the accident. For the next 3 hours, Jessica took detailed notes as I recounted every suspicious phone call, every cold interaction, every moment when David had revealed his true intentions. She asked probing questions that helped me remember details I'd thought were lost to the fog of medication and trauma. Sarah, you said he mentioned restructuring business accounts. Do you remember if he specified which accounts? Was he talking about the business itself or your personal finances? I closed my eyes, trying to pull the memory into focus. He said something about moving fast before I was well enough to ask questions. And he mentioned the insurance payout from the accident, said it needed to be handled properly. Jessica's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard. I'm pulling up everything I can find about your business, your joint accounts, your property records. David doesn't know that I spent 5 years working in financial auditing before I moved to tech. I know how men like him think, and I know how to trace their moves. What she found over the next few hours was more devastating than I could have imagined. Sarah, look at this. Jessica turned her laptop screen toward me, showing a series of bank statements she'd somehow accessed through our shared family accountant. 3 days after your accident, David moved $60,000 from your joint savings account into a business account that only has his name on it. Then, 2 days later, he transferred another $40,000 from your personal checking account. My heart sank as I stared at the evidence of his betrayal. That money represented years of careful saving, the nest egg we'd built together for our future. Money I'd contributed from my library salary, from freelance editing work I'd done on weekends, from the inheritance my grandmother had left me. There's more, Jessica continued grimly. He's been meeting with a real estate attorney about something called a power of attorney transfer. I can't access the details without more information, but the timing is suspicious. The pieces of David's plan were becoming clearer, and each revelation felt like another weight pressing down on my chest. He wasn't just planning to abandon me. He was systematically stealing everything I owned while I lay helpless in a hospital bed. Jessica, what if I really am too brain damaged to stop this? What if the doctors are wrong about my recovery? What if David's right, and I'll never be the person I was before? My sister's eyes flashed with a fierce protectiveness that reminded me of our mother. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, listen to me. You are having a coherent, strategic conversation about complex financial matters while recovering from a traumatic brain injury. You're tracking details, making connections, and asking the right questions. Does that sound like someone who's incompetent to you? She was right, and somewhere deep inside me, I felt the first stirrings of the woman I used to be. The woman who had graduated summa cum laude from library school. The woman who had built a successful freelance editing business while working full-time. The woman who had run 3 marathons not because she was naturally athletic, but because she was too stubborn to quit. What do we do next? I asked, and for the first time since the accident, my voice carried a note of determination. We set a trap, Jessica said with a smile that would have terrified David if he could have seen it. And we make sure he walks right into it. The next morning, Jessica positioned herself in the hospital cafeteria with her laptop, pretending to work while keeping an eye on the elevator banks. She'd calculated David's usual visiting pattern and wanted to observe his behavior when he thought he was unmonitored. What she saw confirmed our worst suspicions. David arrived at the hospital not alone, but with Tom Bradley and a woman Jessica didn't recognize. They spent nearly 30 minutes in the parking lot, heads bent over documents spread across the hood of Tom's car. Jessica managed to take several photos with her phone's zoom feature, capturing images of what appeared to be legal paperwork and financial statements. When David finally came up to my room, he was alone, wearing the same mask of concerned husband that he'd perfected over the past weeks. But now that I knew what to look for, his performance seemed hollow and transparent. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" he asked, settling into the chair beside my bed without actually looking at me. His attention was focused on his phone, fingers rapidly typing responses to messages. Better, I replied, keeping my voice deliberately weak and confused. The doctor said something about discharge planning. I'm having trouble understanding all the medical terms. David's head snapped up, and I saw a flash of something cold and calculating in his eyes before he rearranged his features into an expression of sympathetic concern. Don't worry about that right now, Sarah. The doctors and I are handling everything. You just need to focus on getting better. His tone was patronizing, the same way he might speak to a child or someone he considered mentally deficient. But I want to understand what's happening to me, I pressed, letting a note of plaintive confusion creep into my voice. The nurses keep talking about rehabilitation facilities and long-term care. What does that mean for us? For our house? David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window with his back to me. Sarah, these are complex decisions that require a clear head. The brain injury has affected your ability to process information properly. It's better if you let me handle the business side of things while you concentrate on healing. But what about my job at the library? What about our savings account? I keep having dreams about numbers, about money being moved around, but I can't tell if they're real memories or just medication-induced nightmares. I watched David's reflection in the window, saw his jaw clench and his shoulders tense. He was realizing that my memory wasn't as damaged as he'd hoped, that I might be more aware of his activities than he'd calculated. Those are just dreams, sweetheart, he said, turning back to me with a forced smile. The medication can cause all sorts of confusion. That's why it's so important that you trust me to make the right decisions for both of us. That's when I knew for certain that David was going to try to have me declared incompetent. He needed legal justification for his actions, a way to explain why he'd made unilateral decisions about our shared assets. If he could convince a court that my brain injury had left me unable to make rational decisions, he could justify everything he'd already done and get legal cover for whatever he planned to do next. After David left that afternoon, promising to return later with some papers for me to look at, Jessica and I put our plan into motion. We need evidence of his competency and his intent, Angela Rodriguez had explained during our conference call. If he's planning to claim that Sarah is mentally incompetent, we need to document her cognitive abilities. And if he's stealing marital assets, we need proof of his actions. Jessica had already been working on the documentation piece, recording our conversations and capturing my ability to discuss complex topics coherently. But we needed more. We needed David to reveal his intentions in a way that couldn't be explained away or denied. I have an idea, I told Jessica, but it's risky. What if I pretend to be more confused than I actually am? What if I make him think he can manipulate me into signing something that benefits him? That's dangerous, Sarah. If you actually sign anything, it could be legally binding even if you were coerced. Not if we can prove I was coerced. Not if we can show that he deliberately took advantage of someone he believed was mentally impaired. Jessica looked uncomfortable with the plan, but she understood the logic. We'd need witnesses. We'd need proof that he knew you were supposedly incapacitated and chose to manipulate you anyway. That's when I remembered Marcus, the night security guard who had been so kind to me. Marcus worked the evening shift and often patrolled the hallways when the hospital was quiet. He'd mentioned that he sometimes overheard conversations that made him uncomfortable, situations where family members were pressuring patients or discussing things that seemed inappropriate. Marcus has seen David's behavior, I explained to Jessica. He's noticed the late-night meetings in the parking lot, the way David treats these visits like business meetings, instead of time with his injured wife. If we could get Marcus to witness David trying to coerce me into signing something. It took 2 days to set up the perfect scenario. Jessica contacted Angela Rodriguez, who prepared a fake document that looked official but was actually meaningless. Something about transferring temporary financial power of attorney. The goal wasn't to trick me into signing something real, but to create a situation where David would reveal his true intentions, while being observed by a credible witness. Jessica positioned herself in the family lounge down the hall, where she could see my room but wouldn't be immediately visible to David. Marcus agreed to time his patrol to coincide with David's visit, walking past my room at strategic intervals. And Angela was standing by on a conference call, ready to provide legal guidance if the situation escalated beyond our control. David arrived that evening carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the grim expression of a man about to deliver bad news. He'd brought Tom Bradley with him, which surprised me but probably shouldn't have. Tom had always been the detail person in their business partnership, the one who handled contracts and legal paperwork. "Sarah, we need to have a serious conversation," David began, pulling his chair close to my bed while Tom positioned himself near the door. "The doctors have been talking to me about your condition, and I'm afraid the news isn't good." I let my face show confusion and fear, the emotions I would genuinely be feeling if I believed what he was about to tell me. "What do you mean? I thought I was getting better." "The brain injury is more severe than they initially thought," David continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The cognitive testing shows significant impairment in your ability to make complex decisions. The neurologist thinks it's permanent." This was news to me, since Dr. Chen had actually been optimistic about my cognitive recovery in her last evaluation, but I played along, letting tears gather in my eyes as I processed what David was claiming. "What does that mean for me? For us?" "It means that certain decisions need to be made by someone who can think clearly," Tom interjected, stepping forward with the portfolio. "David has been consulting with lawyers and financial advisors about the best way to protect your interests while you recover." David pulled several documents from the portfolio, spreading them across the bedside table where I could see them. The fake power of attorney form was there, along with what appeared to be real financial documents, including bank statements and insurance forms. "These papers will help ensure that your medical bills get paid, and that our financial obligations are met while you're unable to handle these matters yourself," David explained. "It's just a temporary measure until you're feeling better." I picked up the power of attorney document, pretending to struggle with reading the legal language. "I don't understand all these words. What exactly am I signing?" "You're giving me the authority to make financial decisions on your behalf," David said, his voice gentle but insistent. "It's for your own protection, Sarah. These are complicated matters, and in your current condition, you could make mistakes that hurt both of us." That's when Marcus appeared in the doorway, making his rounds with a clipboard in hand. "Evening, Mrs. Mitchell. How are you feeling tonight?" "Confused," I admitted, which was partially true. "My husband is trying to explain these legal papers, but I'm having trouble understanding them." Marcus stepped into the room, his trained security eye taking in the scene. The documents spread across the table, David's intense focus on getting me to sign, Tom's position blocking the door, my obvious distress. "Is everything all right in here?" Marcus asked, his tone casual but alert. "Everything's fine," David said quickly. "We're just handling some necessary paperwork while my wife is still recovering." "Mrs. Mitchell, do you feel comfortable with what's being discussed?" Marcus asked, addressing me directly rather than deferring to David. "Do you understand what these documents are for?" I looked between the papers and David's expectant face, letting genuine uncertainty show in my expression. "I think so. David says it's to help with bills and financial things while I'm sick. But some of the words are really hard for me to understand right now." Marcus stepped closer to the table, his eyes scanning the documents. "Mr. Mitchell, these look like pretty significant legal papers. Has your wife had a chance to speak with her own lawyer about this?" "That's not necessary," David replied, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. "I'm her husband. I'm looking out for her best interests. But if she's having trouble understanding the documents due to her medical condition, wouldn't it be better to wait until she's feeling clearer? Or at least have someone explain her rights to her?" Tom moved forward, clearly uncomfortable with Marcus's questions. "This is really a private family matter." "Of course," Marcus said politely. "I just want to make sure Mrs. Mitchell feels comfortable with any decision she's making. In my experience, it's always better to take time with important paperwork, especially when someone is recovering from a serious injury." I could see David's frustration mounting. He'd expected to find me compliant and confused, easy to manipulate into signing whatever he put in front of me. Instead, he was facing questions from a security guard who was treating me like a person with rights rather than an inconvenient obstacle to be managed. "Sarah," David said, turning back to me with forced patience, These papers need to be signed tonight. The insurance company has deadlines, and if we miss them, it could affect your medical coverage. This was the moment of truth. David was pressuring me to sign documents while believing I was cognitively impaired, using fear tactics and artificial urgency to coerce compliance. He was doing exactly what we'd hoped he would do, but with Marcus watching and Jessica listening from down the hall. "I'm scared, David," I said, letting my voice shake with genuine emotion. "This feels like a really big decision, and my head still feels so fuzzy. What if I'm signing something I shouldn't? What if I don't understand what it really means?" "You're overthinking this," David said, his mask of patience beginning to slip. "I'm your husband. I would never ask you to sign something that wasn't in your best interest. But if we don't handle this tonight, there could be serious consequences." Marcus cleared his throat. "Mr. Mitchell, if I may suggest. Mrs. Mitchell seems pretty upset about this. Maybe it would be better to revisit this conversation when she's feeling more confident about her ability to understand what she's signing." "We don't have that luxury," David snapped, dropping all pretense of gentleness. "The insurance deadlines won't wait for her to feel more confident. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions, even when they don't feel ready." That's when I knew we had him. David had just admitted, in front of a witness, that he was pressuring me to make decisions while acknowledging that I didn't feel mentally ready to make them. He was revealing exactly the kind of coercive behavior that would destroy any legal justification for his actions. "I think I need to talk to a lawyer," I said quietly. "Before I sign anything this important, I think I should talk to someone who can explain what it means." David's face flushed red. "Sarah, we've been over this. I am looking out for your interests. Bringing in outside lawyers will just complicate things and cost money we don't have." "But you just said this could affect my medical coverage," I replied, using his own words against him. "If it's that important, shouldn't I make sure I understand it completely?" Tom stepped forward, clearly trying to salvage the situation. "Sarah, David's right that time is a factor here. But what if we arranged for you to speak with a lawyer tomorrow after you've signed these initial documents? That way we meet the deadlines, but you still get the legal advice you're asking for." It was a clever attempt at manipulation, trying to get me to sign first and ask questions later. But it was also exactly the kind of statement that would prove they were pressuring me to waive my rights under false time constraints. "That doesn't make sense," Marcus interjected, and I could have kissed him for his perfect timing. "If the lawyer might have concerns about the documents, wouldn't it be better to address those concerns before signing, not after?" David stood up abruptly, gathering the papers with sharp, angry movements. "This is ridiculous. Sarah, these people are filling your head with unnecessary doubts. I'm your husband, and I'm trying to protect our future while you recover from your injuries. If you can't trust me to look out for your best interests, then I don't know what we're doing here." It was a textbook manipulation tactic, designed to make me feel guilty for questioning his motives. But instead of apologizing and backing down the way the old Sarah might have done, I felt something cold and determined settle in my chest. "David," I said quietly, "if these papers are really in my best interest, then you shouldn't mind if I take time to understand them properly. And if there really are insurance deadlines, then you should be able to show me the documentation that proves that." For a moment, David stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time since the accident, recognizing that the compliant, confused woman he'd expected to manipulate was not who he was dealing with. "We'll come back tomorrow," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Hopefully you'll be thinking more clearly by then." As David and Tom left my room, Marcus lingered for a moment, making notes on his clipboard. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I'm going to document this conversation in my security report. If anyone asks, there were witnesses to what happened here tonight." After Marcus left, Jessica appeared in my doorway, her face glowing with triumph and fury in equal measure. "Did you get all of that?" I asked. "Every word," she confirmed, holding up her phone. "Angela was listening too. She says we have enough to file for an emergency injunction to freeze your joint accounts and prevent any further transfers of assets." I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. We'd gotten what we needed, but the cost had been seeing the man I'd loved for 8 years reveal himself as someone I'd never really known at all. Jessica, I said, opening my eyes to look at my sister, I think I'm ready to stop pretending to be weak. The next morning brought Dr. Chen for my weekly cognitive evaluation, and for the first time since the accident, I was able to demonstrate the full extent of my recovery. The fog that had clouded my thinking for weeks was finally lifting, revealing a mind that was sharp, focused, and absolutely furious. Sarah, your improvement is remarkable, Dr. Chen said, reviewing the results of my memory and reasoning tests. Your cognitive function is testing within normal ranges across all categories. The brain is an amazing organ, and yours has clearly been working hard to heal itself. Dr. Chen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Yesterday, my husband told me that you said my brain injury was more severe than initially thought, and that the cognitive impairment was likely permanent. Is that true? Dr. Chen's expression shifted from pleased to concerned to angry in the span of a few seconds. Sarah, I never said anything like that to your husband. In fact, your recovery has exceeded our most optimistic projections. Who told you I said that? David did, last night, when he was trying to get me to sign some legal documents. He said you'd told him I was permanently impaired and couldn't make complex decisions. Dr. Chen set down her clipboard and leaned forward, her voice taking on a tone of professional outrage. Sarah, that is absolutely false. Not only have I never made such a statement, but if I had concerns about your competency, there are specific protocols I would have to follow. Your husband has no authority to make medical decisions for you unless you're unconscious or have been legally declared incompetent by a court. This was the final piece of evidence I needed. David hadn't just been stealing my money and planning to abandon me. He'd been lying about my medical condition to justify his actions. He'd been using my trust in him and my vulnerability in the hospital to manipulate me into believing I was more damaged than I actually was. Dr. Chen, I need you to document my cognitive status officially. I need written proof that I'm mentally competent to make my own decisions. Of course, she said immediately. And Sarah, I think you should know that if your husband has been misrepresenting your medical condition to coerce you into signing legal documents, that could constitute a form of abuse. Have you considered speaking with someone about your options? I smiled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Actually, I have. And I think David is about to discover that his supposedly brain-damaged wife is much smarter than he gave her credit for. That afternoon, while David was presumably preparing for another attempt at manipulation, Angela Rodriguez arrived at the hospital with a briefcase full of legal documents and a plan that would turn his world upside down. Sarah, based on everything Jessica documented last night and the medical evaluation this morning, we have grounds to file several legal actions simultaneously. Angela explained. We can get an emergency restraining order to prevent him from accessing any more of your joint accounts. We can file for separation and request temporary spousal support. And if he's been transferring marital assets without your knowledge, we can demand that those transfers be reversed. What about the business? I asked. I helped build that company with my inheritance money and my unpaid labor during the startup years. Does he get to keep everything just because his name is on the paperwork? Not if we can prove that marital assets were used to fund the business and that you contributed to its success. Jessica's financial analysis shows a clear paper trail of your grandmother's inheritance money being transferred into the business accounts. That makes the business a marital asset, regardless of whose name is on the corporate documents. As Angela laid out our legal strategy, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the accident. Power. Not the kind of power that comes from physical strength or financial resources, but the power that comes from knowledge, preparation, and the support of people who actually care about your well-being. There's one more thing, Angela said, pulling out a final document. I've prepared a power of attorney revocation form. If David tries to claim that you previously gave him legal authority over your affairs, this document will make it clear that any such authority is immediately revoked due to your full cognitive recovery. I signed the document with a steady hand, and with each letter of my name, I felt myself reclaiming the life that David had tried to steal from me. That evening, David arrived at the hospital with a new set of papers and a confidence that was about to be shattered. He walked into my room expecting to find the same confused, frightened woman he'd been manipulating for weeks. Instead, he found me sitting up in bed, fully alert, with Angela Rodriguez beside me and Jessica stationed near the window with her laptop open. "David," I said, my voice clear and strong, "I'd like you to meet my attorney, Angela Rodriguez. We have some things we need to discuss." The color drained from David's face as he took in the scene before him. His eyes darted between Angela's professional demeanor, Jessica's knowing smirk, and my steady, unwavering gaze. This was clearly not the scenario he had prepared for, and I could see his mind racing as he tried to process how his carefully orchestrated manipulation had gone so spectacularly wrong. "I'm sorry, who are you?" David asked Angela, his voice attempting casual curiosity but betraying an underlying tremor of panic. "I'm Mrs. Mitchell's attorney," Angela replied smoothly, standing to extend her hand in a gesture that was both polite and unmistakably territorial. "We've been discussing some concerning irregularities in the handling of her financial affairs during her recovery." David's hand trembled slightly as he shook Angela's, and I noticed a thin sheen of perspiration forming on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the hospital room. "I'm not sure what you mean by irregularities. I've been handling our affairs exactly as any responsible husband would during a medical crisis." "Is that what you call transferring over $100,000 from your wife's accounts without her knowledge or consent?" Jessica interjected from her position by the window, her laptop screen turned toward David to display the bank records she had compiled. For a moment, David looked like he might deny everything, but the evidence was laid out in black and white, complete with dates, amounts, and account numbers. His shoulders sagged slightly as he realized there was no point in pretending ignorance. "Those transfers were necessary to cover medical expenses and protect our assets during Sarah's incapacitation," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. "Any husband would have done the same thing in my position." "Really?" Angela's tone was dangerously calm. "Because according to hospital billing, your wife's medical expenses are being covered by insurance, with only a small deductible remaining. So what exactly were you protecting these assets from?" David's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled for an explanation that wouldn't further incriminate him. Finally, he turned to me with an expression that attempted wounded sincerity but came across as desperate manipulation. "Sarah, you have to understand, I was trying to protect our future. The business has been struggling, and with your medical situation, I needed to ensure we had resources available for your long-term care." "My long-term care in a facility where you planned to warehouse me and forget I existed?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger burning in my chest. "The same long-term care you told Dr. Chen I might be better off dead than needing?" David's face went ashen. He had clearly forgotten about that conversation, or perhaps assumed I had been too medicated to remember it clearly. The fact that I could quote his exact words with perfect clarity was obviously a shock to his system. "Sarah, you're taking that conversation out of context. I was emotional, scared about your condition, worried about our future. Sometimes when people are under extreme stress, they say things they don't mean." "Oh, but you did mean it," I replied, my voice gaining strength with each word. "Because that conversation wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. The late-night meetings in the parking lot with Tom and Nancy. The phone calls about restructuring accounts and exploring options for incompetency claims. The lies you told me about what Dr. Chen said regarding my cognitive recovery." Each accusation hit David like a physical blow. I could see him mentally calculating how much I knew, how much evidence we had gathered, and what his options were for damage control. The confident, manipulative man who had walked into my room expecting to find a compliant victim was rapidly being replaced by someone who looked cornered and desperate. "I don't know what you think you heard, but you were heavily medicated, confused. Your memory of events during that time can't be reliable." Angela stepped forward, her legal training evident in the way she controlled the conversation. "Mr. Mitchell, are you suggesting that your wife is currently cognitively impaired and unable to accurately recall recent events?" "I'm saying that brain injuries can affect memory formation and recall, especially during the acute recovery phase." "Interesting," Angela said, pulling a document from her briefcase. Because this morning, Dr. Chen conducted a comprehensive cognitive evaluation of your wife. According to her assessment, Mrs. Mitchell's cognitive function is not only intact, but actually above average in several categories. She's been deemed fully competent to make her own legal and financial decisions. The trap had been sprung perfectly. David had been arguing that I was too impaired to trust my own memories, while simultaneously trying to pressure me into signing legal documents. Now he was faced with official medical documentation that I was completely competent, which meant either my memories were accurate and he was guilty of everything I'd accused him of, or he had been trying to coerce a mentally competent person into signing documents under false pretenses. Furthermore, Angela continued, we have documentation of your attempt last night to pressure Mrs. Mitchell into signing a power of attorney document while she was expressing confusion and requesting time to consult with her own legal counsel. That behavior could constitute attempted coercion of a vulnerable person. David's lawyer instincts finally kicked in, and he stopped trying to explain himself. I think this conversation has gone far enough. If Sarah wants to involve lawyers in our personal family matters, then I'll need to consult with my own attorney before discussing anything further. That's probably wise, Angela agreed pleasantly, especially since we'll be filing several motions with the court first thing tomorrow morning. Emergency injunctions to freeze all joint accounts pending investigation of unauthorized transfers. Temporary restraining orders to prevent further dissipation of marital assets. And depending on what our forensic accountant discovers, possibly criminal referrals for theft and attempted fraud. The blood drained from David's face so completely that for a moment, I thought he might faint. He had clearly expected this to be a private family matter that he could resolve through manipulation and intimidation. The prospect of public legal proceedings, criminal investigations, and professional embarrassment was obviously something he hadn't considered. You can't be serious, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm completely serious, I said, speaking for the first time in several minutes. You told my doctor I was better off dead. You stole my money while I was fighting for my life. You lied about my medical condition to manipulate me into signing away my rights. And you planned to abandon me in a care facility while you walked away with everything we built together. Did you really think I would just let that happen? David stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, and perhaps in some ways he was. The woman he had married 8 years ago had been young, trusting, and financially dependent on him. The woman who had supported his business dreams while putting her own ambitions on hold. The woman who had believed his promises and trusted his judgment, even when her instincts told her something was wrong. But that woman had died in the car accident, along with my naivety and blind trust. The person sitting in this hospital bed had been forged in the fire of betrayal and abandonment. I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed, and learned that I could survive without the man I had once thought was essential to my existence. Sarah, please, David said, his voice cracking with what might have been genuine emotion for the first time since the accident. We can work this out. We don't need lawyers and court battles. We can sit down together and figure out a solution that works for both of us. The time for working things out was when I was lying unconscious in intensive care, and you were deciding whether I was worth keeping alive, I replied. The time for collaboration was when I woke up scared and confused, and needed my husband's support, not his scheming. You made your choices, David. Now you get to live with the consequences. Angela gathered her papers and stood to leave, her message delivered, and her client's position made crystal clear. Mr. Mitchell, you'll be served with the court documents tomorrow. I'd strongly advise you to retain counsel immediately. This situation is going to move quickly, and you'll want legal representation before you make any more mistakes. After Angela and Jessica left, David lingered in my room, his confident facade completely shattered. He looked older somehow, as if the stress of his exposed schemes had aged him years in the span of a single conversation. How long have you known? He asked finally, slumping into the chair beside my bed like a deflated balloon. Known what specifically? That you were stealing my money? That you were lying about my medical condition? That you thought I'd be better off dead? Or that you never actually loved me? Just the convenience and financial security I provided? David flinched as if I had slapped him. That's not fair, Sarah. I did love you. I do love you. This whole situation just got out of hand. I was scared. overwhelmed, making bad decisions under pressure. You were scared? I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. David, I was the one fighting for my life in an intensive care unit. I was the one with machines breathing for me and doctors unsure if I would ever walk again. But somehow, your fear justified stealing my inheritance money and planning to have me declared incompetent? The business was failing, he said quietly, as if this explanation justified everything. We were hemorrhaging money, and the medical bills were going to bankrupt us. I thought if I could restructure our assets, move things around, we might be able to weather the crisis. Our business, David? The business I helped you start with my grandmother's money? The business I worked evenings and weekends to support while maintaining my full-time job? The business that was supposed to be our shared dream but somehow only had your name on the paperwork? Each question landed like a physical blow, and I could see David struggling to maintain his narrative of being a concerned husband making difficult decisions. The truth was simpler and uglier. He had seen my accident as an opportunity to solve his financial problems while eliminating what he now viewed as a liability. I never meant for it to go this far, he whispered. When the accident first happened, I was devastated. I really was. But then, the reality set in. The medical bills, the lost income, the uncertainty about your recovery. And Tom started talking about asset protection strategies, ways to safeguard the business from medical debt. It seemed logical at the time. And when did having me declared incompetent start seeming logical? I asked. When did abandoning me in a care facility become part of your asset protection strategy? David couldn't meet my eyes. Nancy suggested that maybe it would be better for everyone if we made long-term care arrangements. She said you'd be more comfortable in a professional facility with trained staff, and I'd be free to focus on rebuilding our financial situation. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. While I had been fighting to relearn how to walk and struggling to remember simple words, my husband and his sister had been planning my exile as if I were a burden to be disposed of rather than a human being with rights and feelings. Get out, I said quietly. Sarah, please let me explain. Get out of my room, David. Get out of my life. The next time you want to communicate with me, you can do it through my attorney. David started to protest, but something in my expression must have convinced him that further argument would be futile. He gathered his papers and walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold as if hoping for some last-minute reprieve. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, I really am sorry it came to this. No, you're not, I replied. You're sorry you got caught. There's a difference. After David left, I sat in the silence of my hospital room, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. 8 years of marriage had ended not with mutual recognition of irreconcilable differences, but with the exposure of fundamental character flaws that had apparently been hidden beneath the surface of our relationship all along. But surprisingly, I didn't feel devastated. I felt relieved. The uncertainty that had plagued me since the accident was finally over. I knew exactly where I stood, exactly who I was dealing with, and exactly what I needed to do to protect myself going forward. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Angela's legal machine swung into full operation. Court documents were filed, accounts were frozen, and David's world began to unravel with the same systematic precision that he had used to try to steal my life. Jessica arrived early with coffee and a tablet full of news that made me smile for the first time in weeks. The emergency injunction was granted, she reported with obvious satisfaction. All joint accounts are frozen pending investigation. David can't access any more of your money without court approval. What about the money he already transferred? Angela's forensic accountant is tracing every transaction. If we can prove the transfers were made without your knowledge or consent while you were incapacitated, the court can order them reversed. The hospital room phone rang, and I was surprised to hear Tom Bradley's voice on the other end. Tom had been David's business partner and closest friend for over a decade, but his tone was strained and formal. Sarah, I wanted to call and apologize for my role in what happened. I should have questioned David's decisions more carefully. I should have insisted that you be consulted about any financial changes. Tom, Did you know about the power of attorney scheme? Did you know he was planning to have me declared incompetent? There was a long pause before Tom answered. I knew he was consulting with lawyers about asset protection. I knew he was worried about medical bills affecting the business. But I didn't know about the competency angle until Nancy mentioned it at that meeting in the parking lot. And you didn't think to warn me? You didn't think I had a right to know that my husband and his sister were plotting to have me institutionalized? Sarah, I was trying to stay out of what seemed like a family matter. I realize now that was cowardly, but I genuinely thought David was just trying to protect your interests while you recovered. Tom, David told my doctor I would be better off dead. Does that sound like someone trying to protect my interests? Another long pause. No, it doesn't. And I want you to know that I've decided to dissolve the business partnership. I can't continue working with someone who would treat his wife the way David treated you. This was unexpected news. Tom's decision to sever ties with David would have significant financial implications for my soon-to-be ex-husband, and it suggested that David's betrayal had consequences beyond just our marriage. What will happen to the business? We'll have to liquidate the assets and divide the proceeds according to our partnership agreement. But Sarah, based on the financial records Jessica's been reviewing, you may have a legitimate claim to a significant portion of those proceeds. Your grandmother's inheritance money was used to capitalize the business, and your unpaid labor during the startup years could be valued as sweat equity. After Tom hung up, I felt another piece of my new life falling into place. Not only was I going to recover my stolen money, but I might actually come out of this divorce in a stronger financial position than when I went into the marriage. Angela arrived that afternoon with more good news. The forensic accountant has completed her preliminary review, and the pattern of unauthorized transfers is even more extensive than we initially thought. David didn't just steal the money you knew about. He's been systematically moving assets for months, apparently in preparation for this crisis. What do you mean? He started transferring money out of your joint accounts 6 weeks before your accident. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. It appears he was building a secret financial cushion while keeping you in the dark about the business's real financial situation. The implications hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't just seized an opportunity after my accident. He had been planning some form of betrayal even before I was injured. The accident had simply provided him with the perfect cover story for accelerating his timeline. Angela, does this mean he was planning to leave me even before the accident? It's hard to say definitively, but the pattern suggests he was at least preparing for that possibility. The transfers were too systematic and well-planned to be spontaneous reactions to your medical crisis. I closed my eyes, trying to process this latest revelation. How long had David been deceiving me? How many of our conversations about the future had been lies? How many times had he looked me in the eye and promised me things he was already planning to take away? There's something else, Angela continued gently. The investigation has turned up evidence of additional insurance policies that David took out on your life 6 months ago. Policies you didn't know about, with him as the sole beneficiary. The room seemed to tilt around me as the full scope of David's betrayal became clear. He hadn't just been planning to abandon me. He had been financially positioning himself to benefit from my death. The comment to Dr. Chen about me being better off dead wasn't just cruel indifference. It was the expression of a man who had already calculated the monetary value of my life versus the cost of my care. How much? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. $2 million in life insurance, plus accidental death benefits that would have brought the total to $3 million. I felt sick, not just emotionally devastated, but physically nauseated by the realization that the man I had trusted with my life had been viewing me as a potential financial windfall. Every kiss, every promise, every moment of apparent intimacy had been tainted by his secret calculations about my worth to him, dead versus alive. Angela, I want to destroy him, I said, my voice gaining strength as shock transformed into fury. I don't just want my money back. I don't just want a divorce. I want him to face consequences for what he tried to do to me. Sarah, I understand your anger, and it's completely justified. But I need you to think carefully about how far you want to take this. Criminal charges are a possibility, but they would mean a public trial, media attention, and a long legal battle that could take years to resolve. I don't care about the publicity or the time, I replied. What I care about is making sure David can never do this to anyone else. What I care about is ensuring that there are real consequences for treating another human being like a financial instrument to be manipulated and discarded. Angela nodded slowly. Then we'll explore every legal avenue available. Civil suits for theft, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Criminal referrals for potential charges of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and insurance fraud. And we'll make sure that any professional licenses or certifications David holds are reviewed in light of his conduct. As Angela laid out the comprehensive legal strategy that would dismantle David's life piece by piece, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the accident. Power. Not the kind of power that comes from physical strength or financial resources, but the power that comes from absolute moral clarity and the determination to see justice done. David had made the mistake of assuming that because my body was broken, my spirit was broken too. He had underestimated the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He was about to learn that the woman he had tried to destroy was capable of fighting back with a force he had never imagined possible. The phone rang again, and this time it was Dr. Chen calling to discuss my discharge plans. Sarah, your physical recovery has progressed to the point where you can be discharged to continue rehabilitation as an outpatient. However, I understand there may be some complications with your home situation. That's an understatement, Dr. Chen. I'm in the middle of divorcing my husband, who apparently planned to abandon me in a long-term care facility while stealing my money. I'm so sorry to hear that, but I'm not surprised. In my years of practice, I've seen how medical crises can reveal people's true character. Some spouses rise to the occasion and become heroes. Others show you exactly who they really are when the facade drops. Dr. Chen, can I ask you something? When David suggested I might be better off dead, what was your professional assessment of his state of mind? There was a pause as Dr. Chen considered her response carefully. Sarah, I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I've never had a spouse ask me that question about their injured partner. In my experience, loving family members are focused on recovery possibilities and quality of life improvements. They don't speculate about whether death would be preferable to disability. So his question was unusual in your professional experience? It was highly unusual and, frankly, disturbing. It suggested to me that he was viewing your situation primarily through the lens of burden and inconvenience, rather than hope and healing. That's not the mindset of someone committed to supporting a partner through recovery. This professional assessment would be valuable evidence in the legal proceedings to come. It wasn't just my word against David's about his character and intentions. There was objective professional opinion about the abnormality of his behavior. Dr. Chen, would you be willing to provide written documentation of that conversation and your professional assessment of David's attitude toward my recovery? Absolutely. In fact, I'm required to report suspected cases of abuse or neglect, and David's behavior has raised enough red flags that I've already begun documenting our interactions. After ending the call with Dr. Chen, I sat back in my hospital bed and surveyed the battlefield that my life had become. David had launched his attack when he thought I was most vulnerable, striking at someone he believed was too weak and confused to fight back. But his assault had failed, and now it was my turn to go on the offensive. I thought about the woman I had been before the accident, someone who avoided conflict and trusted too easily, someone who had subordinated her own ambitions to support a man who had been planning her destruction. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder and more ruthless, but also more honest about the realities of the world. David had wanted me to be better off dead, because a dead wife would have been more profitable and less trouble than a disabled one. But I wasn't dead, and I wasn't going to be the quiet, grateful victim he had expected me to become. I was going to be his worst nightmare, a woman with nothing left to lose and the resources to make his life a living hell. The next phase of this war was about to begin, and David was going to discover that trying to destroy me had only made me stronger. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse wearing a navy blue suit that I had bought specifically for this day. My left leg still ached from the metal rods that held it together, and I walked with a slight limp that would probably never fully disappear, but I had never felt stronger in my life. The physical therapy had rebuilt my muscles. The cognitive therapy had sharpened my mind, and the legal battle had forged my spirit into something unbreakable. The criminal trial had lasted 3 weeks, and today was sentencing day. David sat at the defendant's table looking nothing like the confident man who had once tried to convince me I was better off dead. His hair had gone gray, his face was gaunt, and his expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he had lost weight from stress. His attorney, a public defender since his assets had been frozen pending restitution, shuffled papers nervously as Judge Martinez reviewed the sentencing report. The courtroom was packed with people whose lives had been touched by David's betrayal. Tom Bradley sat in the front row, having testified for the prosecution about David's schemes to hide business assets. Dr. Chen was there, having provided devastating testimony about David's callous disregard for my welfare. Even Marcus, the security guard who had witnessed David's attempted coercion, had taken time off work to attend the sentencing. But it was my testimony during the trial that had sealed David's fate. Standing at the witness stand 3 weeks earlier, I had looked directly at my former husband and recounted every detail of his betrayal. The stolen money, the lies about my medical condition, the secret life insurance policies, the planned abandonment in a care facility. I had spoken clearly and calmly, letting the facts speak for themselves without emotional embellishment. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: fraud, theft, elder abuse, attempted insurance fraud, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The prosecutor had painted a picture of a man so consumed with greed that he had viewed his wife's near-fatal accident as a business opportunity rather than a personal tragedy. During the penalty phase, the defense had tried to portray David as a man overwhelmed by circumstances, someone who had made poor decisions under extreme stress, but the evidence of premeditation was too strong. The systematic transfer of assets before my accident, the secret insurance policies, the coordinated effort with his sister to have me declared incompetent, all painted a picture of calculated predation rather than momentary weakness. Now Judge Martinez was ready to pronounce sentence, and the courtroom fell silent as she shuffled through her notes one final time. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Martinez began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered a case that demonstrates such callous disregard for human dignity and marital trust. You took advantage of your wife's vulnerability during the most frightening period of her life, not to provide comfort and support, but to advance your own financial interests." David kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, unable or unwilling to meet the judge's gaze. The evidence presented during this trial shows a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond momentary poor judgment. You planned and executed a systematic theft of marital assets. You lied to medical professionals about your wife's condition. You attempted to manipulate a vulnerable person into signing away her rights. And perhaps most disturbingly, you took out substantial life insurance policies on your wife, while simultaneously suggesting to her doctor that she might be better off dead. A murmur ran through the courtroom at this summary of David's crimes. Even though all these facts had been presented during the trial, hearing them laid out in sequence by the judge made their enormity even more apparent. The court must consider not only the harm you caused to your wife, but the broader message that sentencing sends about society's commitment to protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation by those they trust most. Judge Martinez paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "On the charge of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, I sentence you to 5 years in state prison. On the charges of fraud and theft, I sentence you to an additional 3 years, to run consecutively. On the charge of attempted insurance fraud, I sentence you to 2 years, also consecutive. Your total sentence is 10 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 80% of your sentence." The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. David's shoulders shook, and for a moment I thought he might collapse entirely. His attorney placed a supportive hand on his arm, but there was nothing more to be done. The appeals process would take years, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Additionally, Judge Martinez continued, the court orders full restitution to Mrs. Mitchell in the amount of $437,000, representing the stolen assets plus interest and damages. Your accounting license is permanently revoked, and you are prohibited from working in any fiduciary capacity for the remainder of your life. As the bailiff approached to escort David to begin serving his sentence, he turned to look at me for the first time since the trial began. His eyes were filled with something that might have been regret, but I felt no sympathy for him. This was a man who had calculated that my death would be more profitable than my recovery, who had stolen my money while I fought for my life, who had planned to abandon me in an institution while he started a new life with my assets. Angela squeezed my hand as we watched David being led away in handcuffs. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly. "Free," I replied, and I meant it. For the first time since the accident, I felt completely free from David's shadow, from his schemes, from the fear that he might somehow find a way to hurt me again. The civil settlements had already been finalized, providing me with enough money to live comfortably while I decided what to do with the rest of my life. The business assets had been liquidated, with Tom ensuring that I received my fair share based on my grandmother's initial investment. The insurance companies had paid out my legitimate medical claims while simultaneously pursuing David for the fraudulent policies he had taken out without my knowledge. But more importantly than the financial recovery was the personal transformation I had undergone. The woman who had married David 8 years earlier had been trusting to a fault, willing to subordinate her own dreams and ambitions to support someone else's vision of success. That woman had died in the car accident, along with her naive belief that love and trust were always reciprocated. The woman who walked out of that courthouse was someone entirely different. Someone who had discovered that she was capable of surviving the worst betrayal imaginable and emerging stronger on the other side. Someone who had learned that she didn't need anyone else's validation or support to rebuild her life according to her own vision. Jessica was waiting for me outside the courthouse, her face glowing with satisfaction at seeing justice served. "So what now?" she asked as we walked toward her rental car. "Now I start living again," I said, and for the first time in months I felt genuinely excited about the future. The rehabilitation process had been grueling, requiring me to relearn basic skills that I had taken for granted before the accident. Walking without assistance, remembering names and faces, managing complex tasks that required sustained concentration. But each small victory had built upon the previous one, creating a foundation of confidence that was stronger than anything I had possessed before the accident. Dr. Chen had been amazed by my recovery, both physical and cognitive. "Sarah, you've exceeded every benchmark we set for your rehabilitation," she had told me during my final medical evaluation. "Your determination and resilience have been extraordinary." But I knew that my recovery wasn't just about physical therapy and cognitive exercises. It was about discovering strength I never knew I possessed, about learning that I could survive the complete destruction of everything I thought I wanted, and build something better from the ruins. The house that David and I had shared was gone, sold as part of the asset liquidation process. But I didn't miss it. Too many memories were contaminated by the knowledge of his betrayal, by the realization that while I had been making plans for our future together, he had been planning my elimination from that future. Instead, I had bought a small cottage near the lake where I used to run before the accident. It needed work, but I found satisfaction in the process of renovation, of taking something damaged and making it beautiful again. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. My job at the library was waiting for me when I was ready to return, but I had decided to make some changes to my career path. The legal battle had awakened an interest in advocacy work, particularly for vulnerable adults who might be facing the kind of exploitation I had experienced. Several law firms had approached me about consulting work, helping them understand the victim's perspective in financial abuse cases. "You have a unique combination of personal experience and professional skills," one attorney had explained. "Someone who has survived what you survived and can articulate the impact with your level of education and communication ability is exactly what these cases need." I had also been contacted by support groups for brain injury survivors, asking me to speak about the recovery process and the importance of self-advocacy during vulnerable periods. Initially, I had been reluctant to relive my experiences in public settings, but I gradually realized that sharing my story might help other people recognize and resist similar forms of manipulation. The first time I spoke to a support group, I was nervous about how people would react to the details of David's betrayal. Would they think I had been naive to trust him? Would they blame me for not recognizing the warning signs earlier? Instead, I found a room full of people who understood exactly what it felt like to be vulnerable and dependent on others for care and support. Many of them had experienced their own forms of abuse or exploitation during their recovery periods. Financial manipulation by family members, emotional abuse by caregivers, medical neglect by institutions that viewed them as burdens, rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The thing people don't understand about brain injuries, I told the group, is that they don't just affect your cognitive function. They affect your sense of self, your confidence in your own perceptions, your ability to trust your instincts about other people's motivations. When someone you love tells you that your memory is unreliable, that your judgment is compromised, that you need to trust their decisions because you can't trust your own, it becomes very easy to doubt yourself, even when your instincts are screaming that something is wrong. After my presentation, a woman named Patricia approached me with tears in her eyes. My son has been trying to get me to sign papers giving him control of my finances ever since my stroke, she said. He keeps telling me that the cognitive testing shows I'm not competent to manage my own affairs, but something about the situation feels wrong. Your story helped me realize that I need to get a second opinion and maybe talk to my own lawyer. That conversation convinced me that speaking publicly about my experience wasn't just therapeutic for me. It was potentially life-saving for other people who might be facing similar situations. David's betrayal had been devastating. But if sharing my story could help even one person avoid or escape a similar fate, then perhaps some good could come from the trauma I had endured. 6 months after David's sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call from his sister Nancy. I hadn't spoken to her since before the trial, when she had been subpoenaed to testify about her role in the conspiracy to have me declared incompetent. "Sarah, I know you probably don't want to hear from me," Nancy began, her voice strained and hesitant. "But I wanted to call and apologize for my part in what happened to you." I wasn't sure how to respond. Nancy had been one of the architects of the plan to abandon me in a care facility while David disappeared with my assets. Her testimony during the trial had revealed the depth of her animosity toward me and her willingness to participate in schemes to destroy my life. "I know an apology doesn't undo the damage we tried to do to you," Nancy continued. "But I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what happened, really thinking about it, and I'm horrified by my own behavior. What changed your mind?" I asked, genuinely curious about what could have prompted this call. "My mother was diagnosed with dementia last month," Nancy said quietly. "She's still in the early stages, but the doctors say her condition will deteriorate over time. And as I've been thinking about how to care for her, how to protect her from people who might take advantage of her vulnerability, I keep remembering how easily I dismissed your rights and your dignity when you were in a similar position." There was a long pause as Nancy struggled to continue. "I realized that if someone treated my mother the way we treated you, I would want to destroy them. I would want them to face every possible consequence for their cruelty. And I started to understand why you fought so hard, why you couldn't just let it go and move on. Nancy, I appreciate the apology, but I need you to understand something. What you and David did to me wasn't just cruel or thoughtless. It was a calculated attempt to steal everything I owned while I was fighting for my life. You weren't just dismissing my rights. You were actively working to eliminate them." "I know," Nancy said, her voice breaking, "and I know that I can never make up for that. But I wanted you to know that David's sentencing wasn't the end of the consequences. I lost my real estate license because of my involvement in the financial fraud. My marriage ended because my husband couldn't reconcile the woman he married with someone who would participate in that kind of scheme. I'm facing my own financial ruin, and I have no one to blame but myself." I felt no satisfaction in hearing about Nancy's troubles. Revenge had never been my motivation. Justice had been. David was in prison because his crimes demanded punishment, not because I wanted him to suffer. Nancy was facing consequences because her actions had legal and professional ramifications, not because I had sought to destroy her life. "Nancy, I hope you find a way to care for your mother that honors her dignity and protects her rights," I said. And I hope you never again underestimate the value of someone else's life just because they're vulnerable. After ending the call, I sat on my cottage porch, watching the sun set over the lake, and reflected on how much my life had changed since the accident. The physical scars would always be with me, reminders of how quickly everything can change, and how precious health and independence really are. But the emotional scars had healed into something like wisdom, a deeper understanding of human nature and my own capacity for resilience. I had learned that love without respect is worthless, that trust without verification is dangerous, and that the person you think you know best might be the person you actually know least. But I had also learned that survival is possible even after the most devastating betrayals, that strength can be found in the darkest circumstances, and that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for the best version of yourself. The woman who had married David 8 years earlier would never have imagined that she could survive what I had survived, fight the battles I had fought, or rebuild a life from the ashes of such complete destruction. That woman had been limited by her own assumptions about what she was capable of, constrained by her need for approval and validation from others. The woman I had become was accountable only to herself, motivated by her own sense of justice and purpose, and unafraid of standing alone when standing alone was necessary. David had tried to destroy me because he thought I was weak, but his attack had revealed reserves of strength I never knew existed. As I watched the last light fade from the sky, I thought about tomorrow's agenda: a consultation with a law firm about joining their victim advocacy program, a planning meeting for a new support group for financial abuse survivors, a physical therapy appointment to continue strengthening my injured leg. Simple activities that represented something revolutionary. A life built entirely according to my own choices and values. David had told my doctor that I was better off dead, but he had been wrong about that, just as he had been wrong about everything else. I wasn't better off dead. I was better off without him. I was better off having discovered my own strength. I was better off knowing exactly what I was capable of when everything I thought I could count on was stripped away. The accident had broken my body, David's betrayal had shattered my illusions, and the legal battle had tested every aspect of my character. But I had survived it all, and in surviving, I had discovered something more valuable than the money David had tried to steal, or the life he had tried to control. I had discovered that I was unbreakable. Standing up from my porch chair, I walked inside my cottage and began preparing for tomorrow, confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, I had already survived the worst that life could throw at me. David was spending his evening in a prison cell, paying the price for underestimating the woman he had tried to destroy. I was spending mine planning a future that was entirely my own. 2 years had passed since David's sentencing, and I was standing in the lobby of the Springfield Community Center, adjusting the microphone on the small podium where I would soon address a room full of people whose lives had been touched by financial abuse and exploitation. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny reminders that even the smallest things could catch the light if positioned correctly. My name tag read Sarah Mitchell, Survivor Advocate, and beneath it was the logo of the nonprofit organization I had founded 18 months earlier, Second Chances Legal Aid. What had started as a simple desire to help other people avoid the trap I had fallen into had grown into a full-service advocacy program that provided legal assistance, counseling services, and support groups for vulnerable adults facing financial exploitation. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now making a living from the very expertise that David's betrayal had forced me to develop. His attempt to destroy my life had inadvertently created the foundation for a career more meaningful and fulfilling than anything I had imagined during my years as a librarian. "Sarah, we're ready to begin whenever you are," said Margaret Chen, the community center director who had become one of my closest collaborators in organizing these monthly workshops. Margaret was no relation to Dr. Chen, but the coincidence of their shared surname had felt like a positive omen when we first met. I nodded and walked toward the podium, scanning the audience of about 40 people who had given up their Saturday afternoon to learn about protecting themselves and their loved ones from financial predators. The faces looking back at me represented a cross-section of the community. Elderly widows concerned about their adult children's intentions, middle-aged caregivers struggling to manage their parents' affairs, brain injury survivors still navigating the challenges of recovery, and family members who suspected their relatives were being exploited but didn't know how to intervene. "Good afternoon, everyone," I began, my voice carrying easily through the room without the need for amplification. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 3 years ago, I was lying in a hospital bed with a traumatic brain injury, completely dependent on others for my care and survival. During that vulnerable period, the person I trusted most in the world, my husband of 8 years, systematically stole over $400,000 from my accounts, lied to my doctors about my prognosis, took out secret life insurance policies on my life, and planned to abandon me in a long-term care facility while he disappeared with everything we had built together." A murmur of recognition and sympathy rippled through the audience. These were people who understood vulnerability, who had either experienced exploitation themselves or watched it happen to someone they loved. I'm here today not just to tell you my story, but to share what I learned about the warning signs of financial abuse, the legal resources available to victims, and most importantly, the fact that recovery and justice are possible even in cases that seem hopeless. Over the next hour, I walked the audience through the practical aspects of financial protection, how to recognize manipulative behavior, how to document suspicious activities, how to access legal assistance, and how to maintain control over one's own affairs even during periods of illness or disability. But woven throughout the technical information was the story of my own transformation, from victim to advocate. The most insidious aspect of financial abuse, I explained, is how the perpetrators use their victims' vulnerability against them. They convince you that your memory is unreliable, that your judgment is compromised, that you need to trust their decisions because you can't trust your own. This psychological manipulation is often more damaging than the actual theft, because it makes victims doubt their own perceptions and instincts. An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. "My daughter has been pressuring me to add her name to all my accounts ever since my husband died. She says it's for my own protection, but something feels wrong about it. How do I know if I'm being paranoid or if my concerns are legitimate?" "Trust your instincts," I replied immediately. "If something feels wrong, investigate further before making any changes. Ask yourself, is this person explaining your options clearly, or are they creating artificial urgency? Are they encouraging you to get independent advice, or are they discouraging outside consultation? Are they respecting your right to take time with important decisions, or are they pressuring you to act immediately?" I went on to explain the difference between legitimate estate planning and predatory behavior, emphasizing that loving family members want their relatives to feel confident and informed about financial decisions, not rushed and confused. After the formal presentation, people lingered to ask individual questions and share their own experiences. A middle-aged man approached me with tears in his eyes, explaining that his father with early-stage dementia was being pressured by a younger girlfriend to change his will and transfer property to her name. "I've been struggling with how to intervene without seeming like I'm just worried about my inheritance," he said. "But listening to your story, I realize this isn't about money. It's about protecting someone I love from being exploited." "Exactly," I said, handing him a resource packet with contact information for elder law attorneys and adult protective services. Legitimate relationships don't require secrecy or financial manipulation. If someone truly cares about your father, they should want him to have independent legal advice before making major financial changes. A young woman who had been quiet during the presentation approached as the crowd was thinning out. "Ms. Mitchell, I was in a car accident similar to yours about 6 months ago. I'm still recovering from my brain injury, and my boyfriend has been handling all my financial affairs. After hearing your presentation, I'm starting to worry that some of his decisions might not be in my best interest. But I'm scared that my judgment might be impaired, and I'm being paranoid." I felt my heart clench with recognition. This woman was exactly where I had been 3 years earlier, caught between trusting someone she loved and trusting her own instincts about potential betrayal. "What specifically is making you uncomfortable?" I asked gently. He moved me into his apartment after I was discharged from the hospital, saying it would be easier for him to take care of me there. But I just found out that he terminated the lease on my apartment and put my furniture in storage without asking me. He said it was a practical decision since I'm living with him now, but I never agreed to give up my own place. This was a classic red flag, isolating victims from their independent resources, making unilateral decisions about major life changes, and presenting accomplished facts as inevitable necessities. Has he encouraged you to get independent advice about these decisions, or has he discouraged outside input? He says involving other people will just confuse me and slow down my recovery. He says I need to focus on healing and let him worry about the practical details. I pulled out my business card and wrote my personal cell phone number on the back. I want you to call me tomorrow morning. We're going to help you get independent legal advice and a thorough evaluation of your current financial situation. What your boyfriend is doing may seem caring on the surface, but eliminating your independent living situation without your explicit consent is a serious red flag. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how far I had come since those dark days in the hospital when I first realized the depth of David's betrayal. The woman who had married him would never have believed she was capable of standing in front of 40 strangers and speaking authoritatively about legal rights and financial protection. That woman had been too concerned with being liked, too willing to defer to others' expertise, too afraid of making waves. The woman I had become was comfortable with being disliked, if it meant protecting someone from harm. I had learned to trust my own expertise, earned through the hardest possible education. I was no longer afraid of making waves. I had learned that sometimes making waves is the only way to prevent people from drowning. My cottage had become a sanctuary that reflected my new priorities and values. The walls were lined with books about law, psychology, and survivor advocacy. My desk was covered with case files from clients who had sought help through Second Chance's legal aid. The living room had been converted into a meeting space where I hosted support groups for financial abuse survivors. But it wasn't all work. I had also rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant during my marriage to David. The easel in the corner held a half-finished painting of the lake at sunset, a hobby I had abandoned years earlier when David complained that my art supplies cluttered the house. The bookshelf held novels I was reading for pleasure rather than improvement, stories I chose because they delighted me, rather than because they would impress anyone else. Most surprisingly, I had begun dating again. Nothing serious, just occasional dinners with Marcus, the former security guard who had witnessed David's attempted manipulation at the hospital. Marcus had left his security job to become a social worker, specializing in elder abuse cases. And our shared professional interests had gradually developed into a friendship that was slowly becoming something more. What I appreciated most about Marcus was his complete lack of interest in managing my life or making decisions for me. He had seen me at my most vulnerable and had witnessed my transformation into someone capable of fierce independence. He respected both versions of me and never tried to diminish my strength or question my judgment. "You know what I like about you?" he had said during our last dinner together. "You don't need anyone to rescue you. You rescued yourself, and now you spend your time rescuing other people. That's attractive in a way that helplessness never could be." The observation had made me realize how fundamentally my understanding of relationships had changed. I was no longer looking for someone to complete me or take care of me. I was looking for someone who could appreciate the complete person I had already become, and who shared my commitment to protecting vulnerable people from exploitation. My phone rang as I was settling in for the evening with a cup of tea and a legal brief I needed to review for Monday's court appearance. The caller ID showed the number of Springfield County Jail, and I knew immediately what this meant. "This is a collect call from an inmate at Springfield County Jail," the automated voice announced. "Will you accept charges from David Mitchell?" For a moment, I hesitated. I hadn't spoken to David since his sentencing 2 years earlier, and I couldn't imagine what he might want to discuss now. But curiosity won out over caution, and I accepted the call. "Sarah?" David's voice sounded older, more tentative than I remembered. "Thank you for taking my call. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I replied honestly. "What do you want, David?" "I wanted to apologize," he said quietly. "I know it's too little and too late, but I needed you to hear me say it. What I did to you was unforgivable, and I've spent every day of the last 2 years thinking about how I could have been so cruel to someone who never deserved it." I listened without responding, waiting to see if this was genuine remorse or another manipulation attempt. "I've been going to therapy here, and I've started to understand how toxic my thinking had become. The way I viewed you as a financial asset rather than a human being, the way I convinced myself that your needs were less important than my convenience. I was a monster, Sarah, and I'm so sorry. David, I appreciate the apology, but I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person you tried to destroy. That woman is gone, and the person I am now doesn't need your apology to feel whole or complete. There was a long pause before David responded. I know. I've heard about your advocacy work, about the organization you started. My lawyer mentioned that you've become well known in legal circles for helping other people in situations similar to what I put you through. That's right. Your betrayal taught me things about human nature and legal systems that I never would have learned otherwise. In a twisted way, you gave me the expertise I needed to help other people avoid the trap I fell into. Sarah, can I ask you something? Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? I considered the question carefully before answering. David, forgiveness isn't something I owe you or something you can earn through apologies. Forgiveness is something I choose for my own peace of mind, not for your benefit. And honestly, I've moved so far beyond what you did to me that forgiveness feels irrelevant. You're not important enough in my current life to require forgiveness. The words were harsh but true. David had loomed so large in my world during our marriage and the immediate aftermath of his betrayal, but time and distance had reduced him to what he really was, a weak man who had made cruel choices and was now facing the consequences. He wasn't a monster or a mastermind. He was just someone who had revealed the worst aspects of his character when tested by adversity. I understand, David said quietly. I hope someday I can become someone worthy of forgiveness, even if it's too late for us. David, focus on becoming someone who won't hurt other people the way you hurt me. That's more important than earning forgiveness from someone you've already lost. After ending the call, I sat in my living room thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about both of our journeys over the past few years. David was apparently working on understanding and changing the thought patterns that had led to his crimes. That was good for society and potentially good for him, but it had no bearing on my life or my happiness. I had learned to measure my progress not by David's suffering or rehabilitation, but by my own growth and the positive impact I was having on other people's lives. His apology didn't validate my recovery because my recovery had never been dependent on his acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The next Monday morning found me in family court representing Patricia, the stroke survivor who had approached me after my first support group presentation 2 years earlier. Her son had indeed been trying to manipulate her into signing over financial control, and our investigation had revealed that he had already stolen nearly $50,000 from her accounts through forged checks and unauthorized transfers. Your Honor, I addressed the judge during our motion hearing, Mrs. Patterson's cognitive evaluation clearly shows that she is fully competent to manage her own affairs. Her son's claims about her mental incapacity are not supported by medical evidence and appear to be motivated by his desire to access her assets without accountability. The judge reviewed the medical reports and financial records we had submitted. Mr. Patterson, can you explain these unauthorized transfers from your mother's checking account? Patricia's son, a middle-aged man who had been confident that his mother was too impaired to fight back, squirmed uncomfortably in his seat. Those were legitimate expenses related to her care, Your Honor. I was just helping her manage her bills. Mrs. Patterson, the judge addressed my client directly, did you authorize your son to withdraw these funds from your account? Absolutely not, Patricia replied firmly. I never gave him permission to take money from my accounts, and I certainly didn't agree to the amounts he's been taking. I may have had a stroke, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own finances with appropriate support. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Patricia's son was ordered to repay the stolen funds immediately. All power of attorney documents he had pressured her to sign were declared invalid, and he was prohibited from having any involvement in her financial affairs going forward. As we left the courthouse, Patricia squeezed my arm with tears of gratitude in her eyes. Sarah, you saved my life. If I hadn't heard your story, if I hadn't learned to trust my instincts about what was happening, my son would have stolen everything I worked my whole life to save. You saved yourself, I corrected gently. You recognized that something was wrong, and you took action to protect yourself. I just provided some technical assistance. But as we walked toward the parking lot, I felt the deep satisfaction that came from turning my own trauma into a tool for protecting other people. Patricia would keep her independence and financial security because she had learned to trust her instincts and seek help when she needed it. Her son would face consequences for his attempted theft and hopefully learn that vulnerable family members are not opportunities for exploitation. That evening, I updated Patricia's case file and added it to the growing collection of successful outcomes that Second Chance's legal aid had achieved over the past 2 years. We had recovered over $2 million in stolen assets for our clients, secured protective orders against dozens of financial predators, and provided education and support to hundreds of vulnerable adults and their families. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real measure of our success was in the individual lives that had been transformed. Elderly widows who had learned to recognize and resist manipulation, brain injury survivors who had maintained control over their recovery process, adult children who had learned to protect their parents without infantilizing them, and families who had learned to navigate caregiving relationships with respect and transparency. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Dinner tomorrow? There's a new case I'd like to run by you if you're interested." I smiled as I typed my response. "Absolutely. Your place or mine?" "Yours," he replied immediately. "I like your kitchen better, and I want to see the progress on your latest painting." As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how completely my life had been rebuilt in the 3 years since the accident. The woman who had been married to David had measured her worth by his approval and had subordinated her own dreams to his ambitions. That woman had been generous but naive, trusting but vulnerable, loving but blind to the warning signs of manipulation. The woman I had become measured her worth by her impact on other people's lives and by her ability to maintain her independence and integrity in all circumstances. This woman was still generous, but her generosity was informed by wisdom and protected by boundaries. She was still loving, but her love was grounded in respect rather than need. David had tried to convince my doctor that I was better off dead because a dead wife would have been more convenient than a disabled one. But death would have meant the end of possibilities, the end of growth, the end of the chance to become someone stronger and more purposeful than I had ever been before. Instead, I had proven that survival could lead to transformation, that trauma could become expertise, and that the worst betrayal could become the foundation for the most meaningful work. I had discovered that being better off without someone was infinitely more powerful than being better off dead. As I turned off the lights and settled into my bed, I thought about tomorrow's schedule, a consultation with a new client, a strategy meeting for an upcoming court case, dinner with someone who valued my strength rather than my compliance, and time to work on the painting that brought me joy for no reason other than the pleasure of creation. It was a life built entirely according to my own choices and values, funded by my own work, and dedicated to protecting other people from the kind of betrayal I had survived. David had intended to erase me from existence, but instead his attack had revealed capacities I never knew I possessed, and had launched me into a life more meaningful than anything I could have imagined during the years when I defined myself primarily as his wife. I was not just better off without him. I was better off because of what surviving him had taught me about my own strength, resilience, and capacity for renewal. The woman who had been better off dead had indeed died in that hospital room 3 years ago. The woman who had taken her place was better off alive than she had ever dreamed possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.